I pressed the wrong square on my complicated screen and shut John off. All right, John, you were saying that there's a movement afoot in this project called Save the News. So maybe start that bit over again. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. It's just part of the world we all live in, right? Yeah, so
Yeah.
we Save the News. It's a campaign that we launched, SaveTheNews.org, but you can also find information at NewsGuild.org, our website. Basically, our goal is to try to be able to advocate for journalists in this moment that really happened at the pandemic level when it started, where we just saw a huge loss of jobs across the news industry when people needed them most. So the current most interesting piece is the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation that actually has a decent amount of Republican support because everyone likes more local, right? Local jobs, local journalism is important for anyone, no matter their political preference. Maybe people who are corrupt, they probably don't want it so much. But
That's a good point.
but the Local Journalism Sustainability Act basically would provide tax credits for businesses that employ local journalists, up to $25,000. And it's regardless of whether you're a newspaper, you're digital only, or you're broadcast. So that's, I think, a really good thing. And I think that's something that we should consider making permanent. Because again, go back to the founding of this country, the post office was basically set up to cheaply distribute newspapers and magazines. So at a huge loss to the federal government, subsidizing that. Because again, we were like, this democracy thing doesn't work if we don't have people informed. So it's a model that has been in existence since the beginning of our country. So I like the idea of a tax credit for local journalism jobs, because that would be employed and employing people where they should be in their communities.
So I can see on the SaveTheNews.org website and on the NewsGuild.org website, you have these. You're advocating for, it looks like 5 particular things that you mentioned. Providing incentives for financial investors to sell news organizations to civic-minded local investors. That's super interesting. Like, I guess the government could either incentivize or demand that a certain percentage of news organizations are owned by local groups that wouldn't suffer from some of the things that you were describing, some of the investor class has put in. And then these tax credits and grants that you were talking about. And then breaking up corporate ownership of news organizations. And then 2 other things about increase access to government records and protect journalists and their sources from prosecution. A couple of things that the government could do in its practice as much as its actual structure. How is that coming along? Are there sponsors for this bill? Does it feel like it's sort of on the verge? Is one political party more supportive of it than the other? Where's it currently set?
Well, it's so the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, had bipartisan support, was included in Build Back Better, including co-sponsors of Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. So that's good, and it also had a lot of local support too from Republicans. This idea to break up corporate ownership of news organizations, we don't have anything specific on that front yet. I think the Department of Justice actually could do a way better job enforcing antitrust laws and realizing that there is a huge problem if a hedge fund like Alden Global Capital comes in and wants to buy a publication. Right now, they're trying to buy Lee Enterprises, which is one of the largest newsrooms that Lee has, is the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And if Alden bought it, they would basically try to cut staff and really try to extract as much money as possible. So the Department of Justice could weigh in now to basically say, no, this transaction should not go forward. Right now, it's kind of on pause because the board is pushed the hedge fund off. But I mean, the Department of Justice could regulate these things and think about it on a local level, so we can prevent more and more consolidation. There's the idea, there's no specific piece of legislation live on this yet, but where basically a company could get like a tax break, like, sort of like a charitable donation tax break if they gave a publication back into the community. Because one of our ethical obligations as journalists is to be accountable to our community. And if, it's a local newsroom that's owned by a huge monolith that, its finances are based in the Cayman Islands, it's not properly serving, a community like Denver. So how can we actually support that to be like local ownership there? And then, the tax credit I talked about earlier exists right now for the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. While that's stalled out here in DC, it's actually moving forward in a couple places. New York State's got a similar piece of legislation, and Wisconsin as well, particularly to provide a tax credit to local businesses who want to advertise in local media.
Yeah. I could imagine there are people who, when they hear this, they get super nervous about more government power inside the newsrooms. There's this like independent journalist world. How do you all talk about that and reconcile not wanting the government, or certainly the federal government, to be the one sort of dictating the terms by which reporters and journalists are operating? Is that, I guess that's sort of the other side of, having to work for some, quote unquote corporate overlord or some hedge fund manager, how are people responding to this? Is it mixed inside the Guild? Is it great support one way or the other?
Well, journalists are tend to be very apprehensive about, engaging in anything that's partisan. So, for most of us, we'd never donate to political campaigns. Some people, if they live in a state where you're required to register with a party to vote in a primary, actually refuse to vote in the primary. Some journalists even refuse to vote because they don't want to have any record, even though it's private information, on how they voted, so that they can actually go out in the world and try to be unbiased. So it's a big piece of conversation. But you look at, like I said, look at Canada, look at the United Kingdom. They are holding government officials accountable, even if they're getting more and more public financing for their operations. So it's very possible to do. They do that at NPR. So it's totally possible to do. And I think there is a concern of control from, one administration to the next, right? Like, we don't want, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat or you're independent, you probably don't want someone coming in and mandating it. That's why I think one of these things like the tax credit's really good, because it's not looking at picking winners and losers. It's just like, are you local? Are you a local place that, employs local journalists? If so, here's your tax credit. And so it's not actually picking winners and losers.
I see. It's incentivizing certain behavior and believing that local journalism would be better. Any pushback on that? Are there people who say, no, actually, local journalism has proven over time not to be a better product, or doesn't actually work like that? Is there any movement that has been sort of concerned about local coverage or local reporters or any of this?
Yeah, there hasn't been much of a pushback. I think, again, the pushback that I see is that when people like kind of put everything into like one monolith called the media, right? So if you can avoid doing that, that's a good thing, because you can talk about how you think that MSNBC is too biased to the left and Fox News is too biased to the right or whatever. But then look at your actual local publications. How are they actually covering the news? And they're probably doing it with very few people, not feeling like they're covering enough of your local community. I think the people who are most interested in against local media is basically very clearly fascists, right? Like, that is the people who don't want people to actually have information that's free from bias. They really want to shut that stuff down. So that's why we have to be careful to not just put the media into one bucket, because, clearly having access to fact-based information gives us more power as an individual in a democracy to be able to like know what we're doing. So, don't lob the ball together, because there are people out there really trying to do good work to inform you about your local city council, your school board, and cover high school sports, like that's still like a big part of local communities.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And then I think about myself and sort of do an inventory of, the space between what I say I believe in and how I actually behave. And there's a huge gap, right? Like, I canceled my subscription to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune last year, right? So I just think about all the people like me who say this stuff. But it was sort of like, I don't know, most of the local stuff, I don't know, I just wasn't all that interested in. It was disproportionately expensive. Anyway, I have all these rationales for why I did it. But that's a thing, right? That the very people, who would be advocating for this don't actually do it. It's like it's like, shop local day. People then kind of go and buy some cutesy thing, but still order most of their stuff from Amazon or whatever, or buy it through, Jerry's Hardware, which is part of the Ace network. And it seems local, but it's actually just, the Ace Hardware Center. So what, short of like subscribe to your local news, are there things that people like me who really do care and really do want this to be different and believe it should be different, but, are met with our own hypocrisy on a regular basis? Do you all have, you have a great clear calls for the Save the News Act, or I guess you call it the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. Do you have any advice for the regular folks who listen to this podcast and others if they want to be more supportive of journalism or the news in general about what we should do?
Yeah. So, you call your representative, call your senators to tell them to support the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, I think is key right now. But, it does. I subscribe to a lot of different publications, whether they're local, national, or international. And you do have to kind of look at it. I think being engaged more is another way of going about it, right? So if you're seeing things that are not being covered in your community, send constructive feedback. Reporters get a lot of hate mail, like calling them awful names and treating them terribly. But they love when people say, hey, like, I thought this was an interesting story. Have you ever thought about like writing about this? Or this is a big story happening in my community. I think engaging more. And I think it also requires too the management, and we're a union, we represent the journalists, but I think it also requires the management to think about, that issue of being accountable to our communities. I saw a really good way of handling this in Seattle at the Seattle Times, where we represent the workers there. They had a pretty regular once a week meeting where, every day they talk about what's going to be on the front page of the newspaper and on the website, the main stories of the day that they're hearing from across the newsroom. And they're kind of plotting out their coverage for the day. Well, once a week in those meetings, they actually brought in people from the community to listen in and see how the editors are actually thinking about the sculpting of news in that community. And then at the end of that meeting, they asked the people that they brought in from churches or local advocacy groups or whatever, they asked them, well, what feedback do you have for us? What do you think about this? What stories are we not covering? And I think that's a really important thing, is remembering that our bond is with the communities that we represent, and providing feedback in both directions, I think, is also really important. And then I think investigate it, because Minneapolis Star-Tribune is owned by a billionaire right across the border, in St. Paul. It's owned by Alden Global Capital, that really evil hedge fund. And you can look at the size of the staff in one place or the other, and St. Paul's been decimated. Yeah, for sure. It became sort of it changed a lot. Hey, do you have another minute to keep talking? I know we started a little late. I don't know if you had a hard stop. What is the life like? You're in some ways you have to work on big issues and all these newsrooms, and you're a union-like organization at the News Guild. What's life like for journalists? A lot of people feel like journalists are part of that elite class of people that they don't have contact with, and maybe you follow some of them on social media or Twitter or something and tweet something at them here and there. But people that are on radio and television and in print news and online news, can you just tell us a little bit about the life of journalists, and what do you think a lot of people wouldn't know that would be helpful for them to know, to understand journalists and how they live and function in their work lives? Yeah. So, again, we represent kind of a wide swath of people, from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the New York Times, to the Casper, Wyoming Star-Tribune. And I grew up actually myself in rural Arkansas, in Harmony Grove, Arkansas. So, it feels a little funny for me to have made it to a large publication at the LA Times, where I worked for about 6 years, and then now as president of this organization. And we see, what we've seen is that journalists are just really tired of dealing with a lot of crap from their corporate owners. Gannett is a huge chain. We've had a huge number of journalists organized there. And in fact, in the past 4 years alone, we've actually, in terms of people who have unionized, which every private sector worker can form a union if you've got one colleague in most industries.
Is that true?
You're not a manager. And so, we've had 6,300 workers join our union in the past 4 years, from places like you mentioned earlier, Atlantic. Those journalists joined us last year. Politico joined us last year. Loveland, a publication, a small paper in outside of Denver, Colorado. joined us. So we've had just a huge wave of journalists wanting to unionize, because every private sector worker has rights under the National Labor Relations Act to collectively bargain for better things and be able to discuss their wages, benefits, and working conditions with their colleagues. And so that's really like trying to increase the standard of pay, because journalists are not paid very well. Very low paying job for most people outside of the cable TV, outside of the New York Times. It's a low paying job. You're asked to cover a lot of different subjects, become basically an expert of them, and then go out and report that information. And then they're also, being conned into work overtime, right? And companies like Gannett, who are profitable and pay huge sums of money for their executives, end up really trying to pressure journalists to not take and not claim overtime. And even misclassify them so that they can't file for overtime, so that they work 40 hours a week. And the journalist is like, oh, I got to get this story right. I need to do a little bit more work. So they maybe work 5-10 more hours a week on that story, that news story. And then the company basically doesn't want them to file for it. So it's a pretty difficult life. But that's why they've organized. They basically have formed unions to negotiate. And so you can see it over my shoulder here, but those are from the New Yorker magazine, which recently unionized, and everyone there was gearing up for basically a strike, but they raised the pay for the lowest paid employees up to what would be more livable in New York City, because they said you can't eat prestige. So even if you feel like you're working for a publication that's good, you might not be paid well enough.
Yeah, your landlord doesn't say you can pay 30% less for your rent because you work for the local or national news outlet. That's not a thing. Well, thanks. That's really helpful. I really wanted to sort of get into the, again, for a lot of people, they don't think about the individual human beings behind producing the news. That all of this is done by people. Every sentence, is written, and someone has to edit it.
And then someone's got to get it out. And then there's tech workers who have to get it out on the apps and on the website. We lost your audio. But it is one of those things where it's like, there are a lot of people involved, in the whole process. Actually, today we've got ballots going out for a union election for about 600 tech workers at the New York Times, which you can follow them online if you go to their Twitter account. But it's the New York Times Tech Guild. And those folks are fighting to unionize, and they run basically the apps, the website, make sure that it's actually functioning. So people like us can get access to how many COVID cases are in our community, or what's the most recent breaking news story. I still can't hear your audio. Go wrap here, I guess, with the audio being out. Thanks so much for the time.